Okay, I'm going to hold you to that.
Okay.
All right, well, we're going to get started now on the very first podcast for LMFT Connect. July is National Minority Mental Health Month, and so that's the topic of conversation for today's podcast. LMFT Connect, I'll just tell you briefly if you're wondering kind of what's behind this podcast. LMFT Connect is a new online portal for AAMFT approved clinical supervision where you can do your supervision online. We are also launching peer consultations and webinars and trainings on the site as well. If you want to find out more about it, you can go to lmftconnect.com. I'm the founder of it. My name is Rachel McCrickard, and this was an idea that was just kind of born out of my own experiences of having trouble finding supervision when I was getting licensed, and I thought we got to use technology to make this more accessible. So the podcast today, we're really excited about. We have two really knowledgeable people, way more knowledgeable than I am about minority mental health, which is Dr. Carla Smith and Adam Albrite. Did I say that right? Adam Albrite?
That's okay. Usually I say Albrite, but that's all right.
Albrite.
Either are fine.
Okay. Adam Albrite and Dr. Carla Smith. Let me just back up and give a little bit of context for National Minority Mental Health Month. I have to say that this year, when I started seeing some of that come on my social media, I was like, I don't remember National Minority Mental Health Month. Is this something new? So I did a little research into it. It's been around since 2008. The U.S. House of Representatives named it B.B. Moore Campbell National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. And B.B. Moore Campbell, she's an author, advocate. She was the co-founder of NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness in urban Los Angeles. And she's just been a national spokesperson on minority mental health and lack of access to mental health treatment among minority populations. Unfortunately, she lost her battle to cancer in 2006, but in her honor in 2008, they named July National Minority Mental Health Month. And really the goal of the month is to enhance public awareness of mental illness and mental illness among minorities. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here today by having kind of an open conversation with some of the experts in the field about minority population. Dr. Smith represents, obviously, the Black community, and she's here to speak about access problems and stigma related to that. And then Adam represents the LGBTQ plus population and is here to talk about that. So let me just give you a little introduction of how impressive these two people are. So Dr. Carla Smith, she's the president and owner of Brownstone Counseling. She's also an assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Mercer University. She's a leader in education and training students, professionals, in the public about diversity and inclusion. She's a licensed clinical social worker. She's also a licensed marriage and family therapist. She has over 11 years of experience as a clinician and consultant working with individuals, couples, families, communities, and organizations. She works to encourage and empower communities and organizations to build quality relationships by developing cultural and fostering authentic dialogue. Dr. Smith's education and research and training, along with her passions, has encouraged her specialization in social justice, culturally responsive clinical treatment, inclusion of culture in couple therapy practice, and multiculturalism. And she also recently began a consulting business that provides diversity and inclusion training opportunities to organizations and corporations. So she's passionate about what she's doing, and she aggressively advocates for social justice and inclusion. And I have to say that I have used Dr. Smith to this same end in working with LMFT Connect. She's kind of been my go-to person for issues of diversity and making sure that we're using inclusive language. So it's just good to have a resource like that, someone who's speaking on behalf of a population. And then Adam, he's a licensed marriage and family therapist. He's has been a queer feminist activist for a little over a decade. He's the product of a COAMFT accreditation from his master's to his doctoral training, where he worked under second generation family therapy pioneer Bradford Kenny. He has lectured and supervised therapists and trainings at 2 different universities, and he's led health education programs in sexual assault, bystander intervention, and co-parenting. Right now, his current research focuses primarily on ethics of systemic practice surrounding the clinical care and advocacy for transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. He's a PhD candidate from the University of Louisiana, and his clinical experiences ranges from working in judicial drug court, sexual assault centers, integrated health care, to sliding fee brief therapy clinics. Mentoring young adults and adolescents in healthy relationships has been a focus of his work, and he's currently an organizer in Georgia's Emerging MFT initiative, where he's doing a lot of really good work. So, two super impressive people. So, thank you guys both for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Ditto. Thank you.
Great. Okay, we're going to get into a couple of questions for discussion. And so the first one, in your opinion, I want to know your basic thoughts on if there is stigma related to mental health conditions among the minority populations that you represent, and if so, why?
You want me to go first?
Yes.
So I think that this is something that I kind of thought a lot about before we started speaking. I do think that historically there has been a good bit of stigma with Black community, marginalized populations with getting treatment. I think that it was less, so it's probably twofold. One is that it was more so just kind of a feeling of, in my opinion, being pathologized or being labeled based on various presenting concerns that are social issues. So for example, having to live life or go through daily activities with racism around often can cause anxiety, it can cause depression, and the treatment wasn't and hasn't for a long time, it's kind of shifting, hasn't been prepared to meet the needs of Black communities and Black families and couples and individuals to be able to really be inclusive of that experience, of the experience of oppression, classism, racism, various other isms that Black communities normally deal with. And so what was happening was there was a lot of assumptions being made. And so I think that that's been changing. And I also think that the landscape of who is providing treatment is changing. So I get a lot of Black couples and families and individuals who come to me because they know that, or at least they assume that my experience is so similar in that they don't have to explain the added experience of racism or as a woman, sexism. So I do think that was part of it. I also do think that there's a large population of Christians within Black communities. And so what tends to happen is that we've learned that we can pray about most things, or go to our pastor about things, or go to our church community about things, which is great, and it's a great support. It's just also needing that added therapy and having a licensed individual or a person who is trained in being able to, in my case, systemically work with a person to be able to, meet their needs. And so I do see that there's a lot of churches that are integrating mental and behavioral health into their services. And so that is meeting the needs of a population who would not normally get treatment. So I think that stigma, while there was stigma, I think that it's access that's more so, not just access to care that is compassionate and that takes into consideration the whole experience of Black people that was lacking before. And we're getting there. We're getting to a point of being able to talk more openly about the needs of minorities in mental health.
Yeah, and just to kind of follow up on that question, I'm wondering, I would think in metro areas, accessing a therapist that, that fits with your cultural experience and your background is easier than in rural areas. So
Mhm.
what would you recommend for, say that there's, a Black individual who wants counseling in an area where there's not Black therapists available? Because it sounds like it's really an asset that a Black therapist would bring to the table of, I understand your experience. You don't have to explain all of those cultural
Mhm.
issues to me. But what options are there when there's not a therapist available?
That question makes me think about the intersection of class as well. So I think that certain rural populations, they may have access where someone who doesn't have the financial means to be able to have internet in their home or something like that, that would be that would be an added concern for them to get access. But so I do think that the increase of online services is a great way to be able to get access to great care. And there are more agencies that are providing this service for rural populations. And so again, class would identify who might have transportation or access to going into somebody's office. But I also, especially at Mercer, we talk a lot about having or providing care to people in rural areas because there are so many in Georgia. So, that is through telemental health, but there's also, the need for us to go into people's homes. And so I've done in-home therapy from not just in the area of Atlanta, but like maybe outside, maybe an hour outside of the Atlanta area. And that increases the access to quality, culturally responsive care too.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent. Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. What about Adam for the LGBTQ population?
Yeah. Well, I guess the short answer is yes and no. If there's still stigma related to mental health conditions, to really add nothing to what Carla said, other than specifically the expansion of care. I mean, I echo that completely. As care expands, whether specifically in rural areas, but urban and rural, access to care, as that changes, as that expands, as our minds expand, so does clients, specifically, minority clients, people of color, sexual minority, etc., are just gonna be more open to even going to counseling or therapy. And obviously that there's intersections of race and class that affect that as well. I think there's some, for the purposes of LGBTQ, or what some people, or we might call queer families or individuals, I think there's some historical pieces that are important to punctuate that affect this. The obvious one, prior to 1973, homosexuality was a thriving DSM diagnosis, due in large part to this is exactly what we're talking about. And this was of course removed, but it wouldn't have been removed without large scale movements like the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement at the time. And in terms of research, Alfred Kinsey's research on human sexuality and sexual behavior. In concert with that, around DSM diagnoses and stigmatizing, there's been a recent change that people may not be aware of, but people who work with transgender or gender non-conforming or gender fluid or gender queer, sometimes identifying, there's been changes in the DSM. Prior to the DSM-5, it was like the classification around gender identity disorder. There was tons and tons of task forces and research around trying to get that changed. Now it's gender dysphoria and the accompanying criteria around that. That is important for clinicians who work with these folks because, otherwise you have nothing to go by. But the DSM is a baby starting point in so much else that goes into general incongruity between my sexual or secondary sex characteristics and how I think I should be in my biological. I think the other piece that's important about stigmatizing is historically in this country, but also presently, the uses of reparative or conversion therapy. I mean, obviously, clients still come in today to talk about this, whether lesbian, gay, or transgender. Not so much bisexual, but I think that I imagine it happens. I don't know if you know what, I don't know if, I don't want to assume that people know what conversion therapy is, but it's essentially this sort of practice of psychological treatment or spiritual counseling designed to change or modify a person's sexual orientation from homosexual to heterosexual. And, gender stuff gets lumped in there because I think that it's complicating. In the beginning, people, I think even in terms of the small window of LGBTQ, there's overlap and people aren't sure what that means. What are the differences? And so I have so many trans clients that come in and that people think that I'm gay or that I'm lesbian, and they even almost, language wise push it onto them, whether it's family or and so what's the good news is, well, and in terms of conversion therapy, we're talking, electroshock on one's hands, genitals, and other horribly aversive treatments. But I think there's some good news. There are states that now have a statewide ban on these practices. There's only 9. I looked them up actually because I was like, this is important to know because those are New Jersey, California, Oregon, Illinois, Vermont, New Mexico, Connecticut, Nevada, and Rhode Island. So the bad news is this is still alive and well, this sort of practice. The good news is there are, all mental health professions have come out with position statements against reparative and conversion therapy, but also inside those states that don't have a statewide law, municipalities have developed existing legislative action around the practice. So that's definitely good news. And the other last thing that I was thinking of when you said the question was the history around HIV and AIDS, right? And it essentially starting out in the beginning as often referred to as the gay cancer, right? When we didn't know anything about it, whether you were the president of the United States or clinicians at the time. And a lot has changed, but I think we still have a ways to go, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And you've explained why we still have a ways to go if there's only 9 states that are outlawing conversion. That's super surprising to me. Just a couple of kind of follow-up questions. Well, one, just a statement. I just realized that it's probably LGBTQ is the only people group that have been formally in the DSM as a diagnosis. I can't think of another one where it was an actual condition to be classified in that way. I think that's interesting. And I'm just curious from the community perspective, Adam, is the LGBTQ community happy with the current state of the DSM as it defines gender identity type issues? Right.
It's a real catch-22. I think that activists and scholars disagree, and then they agree on a lot. And there's certainly movement around the considerations of it being not a mental disorder and it being a medical condition around endocrinology, right? Because that's what we're talking about. If someone is wanting to, feels necessary to transition. So that begins with, depending on whether we're, born a female and then wanting to, identifying as male and vice versa. Some of the first steps is there's lots of criteria around this really briefly. You have the beginning is kind of this hormone replacement therapy, right? And sometimes, trans folks can go assuming they identify that way, they can go to clinics and they don't require initial documentation from a mental health clinician. Right off the bat, places like San Francisco, I imagine, do not. There may be one spot here in Georgia, even I think I could say statewide. I don't know if that's true or not, but they have someone there that can kind of make that initial assessment. But other than that, you have to pay and go to a mental health provider of some kind who has some level of expertise in this area, and then you start from there. So it's such a grueling process, but it's worth it for most folks. And, there's so much discourse across. I mean, we could spend hours talking about the juxtaposition between the clinical discourse and then popular culture and so on.
Yeah. So we're not going to solve it today, I guess.
No.
Well,
but
oh, sorry. Go ahead, Adam.
Oh, about starting the conversation. That's great. I mean, it's really joining the conversation because it's happening.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah. So, back to you, Dr. Smith, on how is mental health talked about within the minority population. So, say a parent has identified a mental health issue in their child, what would be their viewpoint of that and on seeking treatment?
I think it depends on what goes on before then. So there is, in my opinion, an epidemic of our schools having way too much input on diagnosing, inappropriately diagnosing young males of color with ADHD or ODD or something of the sort, which then they are the ones, the school is the one that says, okay, you have to get your child into therapy, mainly to get medication, because they can't stay in this classroom, or they're going to be put into special education, or they're going to be kicked out of the school completely. And so a lot of those conversations are initiated by schools in a way that is largely negative. And so the parents, assuming that the schools are there to help, are, by the time they get to a mental health professional, are either frustrated, are scared, are confused because they don't know all of these terms, or, where they came from and why, when their child is at home, there's not, these same concerns. And so it really depends on how a parent, for example, is introduced to getting the services for their child. And most often it comes from them being labeled. And so they are wanting the school, for example, to stop calling them and saying, come pick up your child. Or, I've had plenty of clients who have lost their job because they're getting calls by the school saying that their children can't stay there day after day. And so they're coming to therapy with all of this, in my opinion, trauma, when it comes to getting services. So it's not something that is seen as positive at that juncture. I do know, though, that there's a lot more conversations within communities of color, Black communities specifically, where people are saying, get help, don't suffer alone. There are a few people that I see on social media and also just in blogging communities, writing communities, where there's a lot of conversation about Black women in particular having this view of being strong and having to, kind of handle everything and not talk to anybody about it. And how that can contribute to depression, how that can contribute to anxiety, how that can contribute to suicidality without feeling that it is a strong thing to do to ask for help, because they're being, they're kind of being labeled as the angry person or the this and the that. And so the willingness to go get help is not always there because of the fact that it's kind of like this, it was kind of like this, well, you're weak, you can't handle it, blah, blah, blah. But now there are a lot of communities that are, and therapists who are wanting to work with specifically Black women or Black families or families of color who are saying, no, this is not weak. In fact, it is something that we all need to do, regardless of what other people are labeling you as or saying that you are. We all need to be engaged in this treatment, this help, because it helps us. It helps us all. And so those are the conversations. And interestingly enough, you talked about Bibi Moore Campbell. Her daughter recently surfaced on social media. Her daughter was an actress and recently surfaced, clearly having some struggles with substance abuse and mental illness. I believe that it has been known for a while that her daughter has had mental illness. But so people are exploiting this young lady, and they're showing videos of her and putting it on social media, and so obviously it went viral. But so there was a second video because LL Cool J, the rapper, she used to work with him on a show, and so he, after the first video, he reached out and he said, "Can somebody help me find her? Because I want to help." And so she had a second video, and essentially she said, even through her clear struggles with some sort of substance, she had the clarity of mind to say, I don't need help. All I need for you to do is a mental health benefit or something like that, she said. And so she has always, just like her mom, was a champion for getting help, for destigmatizing, for even if she wasn't ready to take the help at that time, she recognized that there are plenty of people, that there are millions of people who are in need of support versus labeling as, crazy or weak or whatever, to be able to get these services. So I am seeing more people who are readily calling and saying, I need help. I don't know why. I don't know what's going on. I've had plenty of people actually in the last year say, I don't know what's wrong. I don't know what's going on. I just don't feel right. And that in and of itself is movement. To just say to a stranger of all people, I need help. And so I do think that there is, and I hope that I answered your question, that there is, kind of this movement of getting mental health services specifically. Yeah. It's exciting to me.
Well, and I think too, as more well-known types of people come out and are out, advocates for this kind of thing. I know I've been a lot lately about Jay-Z's latest album, and
oh yeah, absolutely,
going to counseling on it, and people are saying, when he kind of gives this stamp
right.
of approval of reach out and get help when you need it, it has a ripple effect, I would think.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's wonderful. I think that it's great, and I think I think that also the reference was, getting help with their marriage as well, and that in and of itself is a thing that, again, we don't necessarily see. What we see is a lot of negative socio-historical factors that impact families and couples. And so we have, let's say, a Black couple who has all of this kind of going on. There's struggles, there's, anxiety around, for example, the police that are playing out in relationships in different ways. And, to go and get help to sort this all out and be encouraged to do so by someone who, everyone's like, is cool. And, we hear him rapping and we see him on stage and all of these things. And he was vulnerable enough to say that is much bigger than, what I can do on my platform. His platform is considerably bigger. So, I always say, celebrities and musicians should really be having these conversations, because they do. They go, Ron Artest years ago, the basketball player, he said during one of his interviews, I want to shout out my therapist. And that was like this huge conversation because he was, everyone's like, oh, Ron Artest is crazy, he's angry, blah, blah, blah. But he went through this transformation. and he attributed that to therapy, which is awesome.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to use the platform of influence.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of another football player. I would have not known about this, but my husband told me. Like, Brandon Marshall, maybe? I don't know. I'll look it up and put it on.
It sounds familiar. The name he's a football player, so.
Okay, I'm in the right sport.
Yeah, I think you are.
There. Maybe he also deals with mental health and has started kind of a foundation about that. And I'll put it out on there, but I think there is something about that.
Yeah.
Adam, we'll switch to you so you can talk about how mental health is talked about among the LGBT population.
Yeah. Well, sort of echoing Carla, it so much varies on the degree of what the current sociopolitical climate looks like, right? But at the same time, so many couples and families come in and same-sex couples come in and they're just wondering, am I being a good parent? There's just some general normalizing that takes place in the beginning, especially if we're juxtaposing that with school. If there's bullying or there's any sort of backlash against to a kid for being LGBTQ or having a gay or lesbian set of parents or caregivers, and so are my struggles sort of normal? For transgender and gender questioning, it's several-fold. How am I going to find someone to work with me? How in the heck am I going to pay for all this, required treatment based on these, for my life, seem arbitrary standards? I should be able to just do what I want to do. I'm suffering here. I think it's also a legitimate fear, to pivot a little bit, of being turned away or discriminated against in therapy. And believe me, it happens. I have gotten clients who, and heard from colleagues about therapists still turning people away because of being identifying as LGBTQ or whatever. And I've also gotten some feedback, and I don't know if this is sort of isomorphic to this movement, but this budding religious freedom movement has been happening for some time, and toward being able to deny a consumer, deny them services because it conflicts with one's religious faith, someone's beliefs or doctrine. And so proponents of this movement certainly don't agree with same-sex marriage, much less same-sex couples having children, whether biologically or adopting. And I think to a larger point, they feel as if, and they've said this has been the rhetoric over and over, that it's the sort of challenge or attack on what's called traditional marriage, right? And funny enough, this is an interesting point. I'm not sure that I disagree with them. I agree that this is going to fundamentally change traditional marriage. Queer people have been challenging the status quo for lifetimes. And inevitably, ideas around practice of marriage, right, and creating family begins to show these differences as we progress. It already has. I mean, we could go on about the beginning of time, how marriage sort of developed. Many scholars around it being about staying together, just against the sort of the foreign world aside, but also about ownership of land and property, and quite frankly, of women and children. I want to make sure that this kid is mine, not someone, and so that sort of evolves and evolves. So of course it has to change, right? I always come back to this note from Mary Catherine Bateson, the daughter of Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead. She says, the family is changing, but it's not disappearing, right? We have to broaden our understanding of the family and look for the new metaphors that make sense. So and so that's happening for sure, but we continually have to be careful to honor the progress that has been made, with steps back in the most recent few years, but not honor it too much that we become stagnant and begin resting on those, resting on your laurels or resting on that progress too firmly, I think.
Yeah, because it sounds like there's still work to do.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. I want to kind of shift the conversation a little bit to talk specifically about our field as clinicians and what changes, therapists like me could make in my wording and how I speak about minority populations and mental health, and just obviously in what I say, but also in what I write in my my marketing material, my paperwork, that kind of thing. And I was sharing with Dr. Smith and Adam before this that I have one of my Black friends told me, I kept saying something about the African American community, or you're part of the African American people, and he just stopped me. He's like, Rachel, just like call me Black. I just want you to say I'm Black. Like that's how I want you to identify me. And it was really helpful for me to just hear it. This is how I want you as my friend to identify me. Similarly, as I've been emailing with Adam, I noticed in his signature line, he has like pronouns, he, his, him. I think that this is what he's saying is like, this is the way that I like to be referred to. And I would like to know that from you too. And Adam, you could speak to that a little bit, but those are just two examples of what I'd love to hear from you now, which is how can we talk in an inclusive way as clinicians to potential or current clients?
Yeah, so the way that, go ahead.
Oh, I just said, yeah.
Oh. Okay. The way that I kind of see it is largely that if we shift our expectations from, let's say, for example, we want to be culturally competent framework to we want to be, and the term in the literature is culturally responsive, because competence would say that there's essentially, a level that you can meet, and you're competent, you're good, you're done, your work is done. Responsiveness is something that shows that number one, it's an action, and number two, it's ever changing. You're responding to what's happening, around you. And culture is something that is ever changing, that is always around us, that we, in my opinion, should always be aware of and do our part to act, to, influence the culture. And so in my opinion, in order to be culturally responsive, you must first recognize that people get the say. They get to say how they want to be labeled, what their identity is, if they don't want to be labeled at all. And who am I to argue about that? I'm not this competent person who now tells you what I'm going to call you just by looking at you, or things like that. So, and also recognizing that can change. Today, I may want to be African American in this conversation. Tomorrow, I may want to be Black, and I'm allowed to do that. And anyone is allowed to do that. So recognizing that people's language and the way in which they identify themselves is what leads. So I always discuss with my students and supervisees that they should be having these conversations with their clients, not assuming, having paperwork, having, intake conversations, having an intake process where they are asking these questions. How would you identify your race? How would you identify your class, your gender, your sexual identity, or sexual orientation? Where do those, what do they mean to you? And it's not to label, it's not to put into a category. It's so that I can know how to engage with you, so I can know who you are. And also to say that if someone says, I identify as a Black American, that's not the same Black American as I identify as. So tell me more about that. Being curious and genuinely curious, as not to say the wrong term or the wrong label, but to also let people know that you are interested in who they are, in all of who they are, and their choices in saying you know? And so I think that is important as MFTs to recognize that we are a part of a world where people are able to be who they are and should be able to be who they are. And that when they come to you and they share that with you, that they're sharing a part of them, that is, in my opinion, the most humbling experience. For someone to openly say to a cisgender person, you know, this is how I identify. These are the pronouns I want you to use. Or to ask, like I've had clients be like visibly surprised that I will identify my pronouns, and I say, you know, what are some that what are yours? You know, or did I say that correctly? Did I speak out of turn? Did I, you know? I've had a client say, you can't use queer. That's not for you, you know, and respecting that, not saying why. That's okay, you know. And so it's very much so when people are different than, or visibly different than us, or we think that they're different, shifting to a curious stance of, you know, just tell me about you, and being open to talk about yourself as well. That's also sometimes against the MFT rules. You know, talking about, you know, who you are as well. Our clients want to know that they're not being vulnerable by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Really helps to lay that foundation of rapport building from the very beginning, that I see you and you see me, and there's, you know, cohesion between us. It also made me think about this quote that one of my favorite authors, Glennon Melton, she says that people are not supposed to be tolerated. You know, traffic jams are supposed to be tolerated.
Right. Yeah.
To be celebrated. You know? And just that idea of whatever you're bringing, whoever you are that's coming, then I want to celebrate that. You know, I tell my supervisees sometimes when they struggle with switching pronouns for someone who's dealing with gender identity type issues, as soon as they make the switch, you make the switch. I mean, immediately he is gone. It's she. She has told you it's she, you know? So whatever things self-identity stuff you need to work through to get there, that's what you need to do, you know? So Adam, can you speak to that a little bit too?
Well, yeah, you know, it made me think of working with a family where, you know, working with families and teens, young adults, and is incredibly difficult and challenging. A great challenge to have, a great problem to have, but it definitely presents a lot more complexity than if you were just working with a grown person coming in. And I was thinking about recently this, even sort of being self-reflexive in the moment, when I have a young adult who, I mean, young kids these days come in, they know as much as I do or more. I mean, they, you know, with the web and social interaction changing the way that it has, free access to information, has just revolutionized, that can't be said enough, revolutionized how people can shape their worlds. And so I had this teen who, you know, identified as he, et cetera, and then surprised me one day and brought in a different parent. And I was like, oh, who wasn't using his preferred pronoun and was also using the name given at birth. And so I found myself an interesting sort of dance I was doing between keeping a relationship with the teen and fostering a new relationship with, you know, the other parent. And I found myself going back and forth in session in a very smooth way that I thought would be really cumbersome. I think we think that it's going to be really clunky, and if it is, that's okay. But sometimes you surprise yourself as you get a little more seasoned and do a lot more reading, you find yourself being able to navigate this almost grown person that we're dealing with, you know, to the parents, right? This is a grown person almost. It's not 10 years old, right? And going back and forth between pronouns and names, it was fascinating to sort of do. There's also this kind of, perhaps folks know about what's called affirmative practice, or the practice of affirmative therapy or affirming therapy. I always like to say affirming because I feel like it's closer to a verb and it's a little easier. There's a lot more flexibility rather than saying I'm an affirmative therapist. It's real kind of stagnant, right? When something becomes an adjective, and that's just the general approach to therapy with clients, that you embrace the positive view and life and story of someone who identifies as lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual, but also address the negative influences around homophobia, transphobia, and heterosexism. Now, so you have to ask yourself, could I be an affirming therapist? And I think a lot of folks, I don't know if that's true. I see in the past several years, you see LGBT issues coming up as a plot point. For I work with, I'm sure Dr. Smith can speak to this. I work with, and I think that's terrific. But obviously, the critical theorist in me is always listening really closely to colleagues that kind of talk and how they talk about that, because we need therapists and counselors, and they need to make money, right? But the second you start expanding your practice as a way into issues that affect people of color or other, I think that's really problematic. And I don't think that it happens a lot, but I think at some point there's this sort of navigating that that maybe stem from genuine curiosity, but again, I think it oftentimes doesn't. I don't have data to prove it. It's all anecdotal, but in sort of conversations that I have with even clients coming in, I went to this person because they said, blah blah blah, right. And it didn't turn out that way. And if language is a shaper of reality, we have to continually know those shifts. For example, even in the transgender clinical world, the shift from a sex change operation of yesteryear to gender affirming surgery, what we call it now, and know that heck, in 6 months we could be kind of embracing a different sort of way to describe that. Like Dr. Smith mentioned, the preferred pronouns. I loved training and working with new clinicians trying to answer a phone and try to not say the yes ma'am or yes sir, and that's about you, not about them. Right. I honor your desire to respect the person on the other line, but know that this is regional, if cultural, if not regional, and that you can speak to them as we're all grown-ups here, and they're calling you for a service, not asking for another beverage, or you know what I mean? Like it's not, you're not sitting on, it's not someone you know. So you find out their name right away so that you can say their name rather than sir or ma'am, right? And so it's fun. I enjoy doing that. But like Dr. Smith said, you make a mistake. We all make mistakes. Error is important. And so but it's how we come back from, this is with supervisees, it's how we come back from the error that matters most. And so, for example, if you do use something incorrectly or say something, kind of step on your words, address it, get over it, because they're going to get over it, right? I mean, the more and more you continue to draw that distinction, I'm so sorry, it's just going to belabor it over and over. You say, I'm so sorry, what is your preference? And then if you're on the phone with somebody, you've never met them, I am so sorry. Do you know this has been one heck of a day? I apologize. Like something like that, rather than this sort of overemphasis at times on stuff, in terms of
feel better.
Yeah. Right. Trying to take care of yourself.
Right. And I like how you described it in terms of it being okay for it to look a little clunky sometimes. I mean, if I'm putting myself in the client's shoes, I would so much more value someone who's saying, walk me through this. I'm sorry I don't already know it. Tell me how you would like to be referred to. I want to learn. Like, I want to know you. And I think people will see that, they will see like the genuineness behind that versus just trying to be super professional and not know what, pretend that you know what you don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And being able to say when we make a mistake is something that is so insightful that, and not just say it, but not linger on it. If there's internal shame, like deep shame that comes up when you make a mistake like that, that's a whole nother issue that you need to go work out, on your own, not with this client. And so to continuously, profusely say, I'm so sorry, that's about something so much more than that interaction.
It sure is. Yeah. So I'm just going to ask one last question here to kind of finish us up, but it's kind of a two-part question. One is, is there one thing that you wish you would have known when you were first starting out, just kind of a nugget that we can give to new incoming clinicians around cultural sensitivity? And then also, what helpful resources would you recommend if someone wants to learn more on this? And I'll just say a little shout out that I'm sure Dr. Smith would love to hear from you if you want some of that cultural sensitivity training that you do for organizations. I'll definitely put a link to that. But then Adam, maybe you could also recommend places that they could go for more learning on this issue. So Dr. Smith, do you want to start with that question?
Yeah. So one thing that you said, I wish I knew, is that was the question? Yeah. I thought so much about this question. I don't know why I'm stumbling. Okay.
Me too.
So, this was the question I really thought so much about. Clearly I didn't come up with an answer. So the first thing I'll do a completely answer the question and then I'll sort of not answer and then I'll completely answer. So the sort of not answer is, I wish I knew just how many other therapists there were out there that were not going to meet the needs of marginalized populations. I wish I knew just the environment that I was getting into. The stories that I have heard over this time have been embarrassing when it comes to marginalized populations seeking out services. And that's across the board. It's not just in working with, racial minorities or sexual minorities. It's across the board. We're now having a lot of conversations with people about immigrant populations and the amount of people, immigrants who are documented or undocumented, and the conversations that they are having to have essentially is sickening to me when they're attempting to get services for something that may not even have anything to do with their citizenship status. So I wish I knew that. Not that I know what I would have done if I knew, but I would be more prepared and not, kind of so surprised when someone says that. I'm genuinely surprised by the experiences that people have talked to me about. So that's sort of answered the question. The complete answer, I wish I knew how humbling this work would be. That every time I thought about a person who is marginalized in many parts of their life, who walk through life and experience people saying things to them that some other people don't experience at all, being called names, being bullied, as adults, being bullied at their job. I wish I knew that when people were sharing that with me, that I knew just how humbling it would be. I like, tears have been brought to my eyes, which I'm okay with that. But I've been at a loss of words at how humbling this work is, and just how thankful I would be to the clients that I have for just trusting me. Because I feel like I might sound like, I don't know what I'm talking about, because I'm like, I babble all the time. I'm like, trying to make sense of the magnitude of much of the work that I do. It's big work. It's important work. And we may be the only people in that person's life who asked them, what was that like? Mm-hmm. And like that humbles me every single time I think about it. That it brings me back to that place of, I don't know anything. I don't know a thing. This is like, I have to sit in a space of, I absolutely don't know what it's like to be my client or to have that experience. And so it's humbling, but it's also like, all this money I have spent, and I literally don't know a thing about people, about how bad they can be, but then also how resilient people can be, who have the experiences of marginalized or minority populations.
It definitely, I think, too, gives us an opportunity to really allow our clients to be the expert in the room.
Yeah, absolutely.
Issues, I remember this training I went to once on, working with parents, and the question came up of, what if they ask me, do you have kids? How do I answer that? Because it kind of invalidates them in a lot of ways. If you say like, no, I don't even know what it's like to be a parent. And so he said, answer it honestly, yes or no, quickly move past it and say, but you are the best expert on your children, And so really just transferring it back to them to say, it doesn't really matter if I have experienced this or not. What matters is that you have, and we're here to talk about you. And I just love that response. I think it relates to a lot of different areas. So thank you for those words, Dr. Smith. And Adam, how about you?
Yeah, to answer your first question, I mean, you almost brought a tear, Carla, for sure. Like I just listening to you talk about that, it really resonated with me. I mean, I couldn't agree more, even though obviously my experience is different. It's strange how, and I can't believe I'm saying this publicly. I've certainly said it behind the scenes, but there are times when I feel like called to do this work. I mean, it's very, and I really stumbled into doing therapy, right? I mean, I started out as an English major. I wanted to go into theater. I wanted to be a poet and a singer-songwriter. I never wanted to. I would have cringed at the thought, looking at the future me. And I dropped out of school, right? I never thought I'd end up here. But all of those, my own resources have helped me so much in therapy, especially around performance and curiosity and sitting with people. I don't have something as beautiful as Carla, but there's several things that I can think of, but anecdotally, which I think is good, I wish I had known that my own identity is okay, right? I wish I had known that my own cisgender privileges, race privilege, and then that intersected with being queer and all of these other sort of these matrices of domination, you might say, navigating that, being very paradoxical at times. I wish I had been comfortable in the beginning. Like I would say to my future self, that's okay. For example, when I was a brand spanking new clinical intern, there was this developing support group for LGBT folks, which I was interested and I sat in, but I distinctly remember, I don't know what it was like, but I was apprehensive at first. And in meeting with the faculty mentor about it, and I don't know why. I don't remember what was informing it, but maybe I thought that being involved in an LGBT support group was sort of a foregone conclusion, right? Of course you're going to be involved in and I thought, and those were, I feel like I was a baby clinician at the time, so I didn't know any better. But and she just reframed it as a strength right away. Adam, it's entirely possible that your unique experience will lead to beautiful and unique questions that maybe wouldn't have emerged otherwise, right? And that you're already thinking about this ahead of time is really important and worth sort of noting. So as long as that doesn't cloud your curiosity, right? So it's sort of this weird kind of two pieces, right? You come in and you know stuff, but as long as it doesn't cloud your curiosity, and you're like, well, I know what you're going through, or fall into that pattern. Because sometimes clients, they like, you know what I mean, you're like, well, I mean, I think I do. And then what about blah, 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 right? So just knowing that it's okay to be me. And that's what makes therapy, or the therapeutic relationship and the experience, richer.
Mm-hmm. People want to see us, they want to know that this is a human interaction field.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, good stuff, you guys. I almost feel like I couldn't have found two better people to interview about this topic. I'm like super proud of myself. I'm like,
are we out of time?
Yeah. Great job.
We're slightly out of time. Yeah. Maybe, I don't know. I feel like I don't want to keep going too long, but any just last minute helpful resources you should read this book that you want to say to people listening?
Yeah.
Which have to be like in the millions, right? There's probably
there's way too many books to say. I though would encourage clinicians, MFTs, to actually go and do like a workshop, like a face-to-face workshop, whether it be at AMFT or a CEU, or just even outside of the profession. There are plenty of opportunities to get some sort of training with marginalized populations, or with integrating religion and therapy and having those conversations. I always suggest doing some sort of social justice training. And there is, I just last year went to a training at the Social Justice Training Institute, SJTI. Yep. And they have 2 trainings a year, and it is wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. It's normally for professionals in student affairs, but they took me with open arms, and so I would always be like, oh, and therapists too. But it was absolutely life-changing. So I would suggest in the profession going to different trainings, but also branching out. Student affairs is one of those professions that's really great with having, actual interactive experiential training when it comes to social justice, diversity, and inclusion. And so I would absolutely recommend it for all therapists, and you might see some coming your way soon.
Well, and that, I'll add the link to that, SJTI. And did I remember saying, I know that our AAMFT magazine came out with like the breakout sessions for the conference. Do you have one, Dr. Smith?
I do. It is, it's more of an ethics workshop. It's on something about ethics in the postmodern era. So we are going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about creating safe spaces. The shift from safe spaces to brave spaces in the therapy room. So that will be, I believe, Friday afternoon. Right. We will be presenting that.
Good. Okay. And if you have other resources to share, let us know. And we'll
absolutely, I will.
Yeah. How about you, Adam?
Ditto. So everything that Carla said, which was beautiful, be a lifelong learner, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's why we got into this. And in terms of AAMFT, there's a queer caucus that has been, had what created some years ago. And so I would definitely follow them. I mean, they sort of provide an open space that's inclusive to kind of talk about the issues, talk about research, and essentially they're like mirroring other associations, which have done a lot more legwork than AAMFT perhaps has done yet. But this is sort of the task force in a way to kind of start this process. And they meet freely and it's free to come. So I even wrote it down here. At the National Conference in Atlanta, they meet Saturday from noon to 1:30. So mark that down. I have no idea where, but they meet. And so that's kind of cool. Go and you'll learn more that way. You're right. There's a lot of books, and maybe we could send those off to you, like a top 3 or something. Because let's be frank, if you're a clinician, and you're outside of academia, you don't have the privileged access of all of the hot research that's coming out, and outside of the journals that are like outside of JMFT, which has hot stuff. But we have to remember that, those of us who are in academia who have that access, and how do we kind of share that freely through workshops, through conversations. And so really just getting involved, right? If you want to like be an affirming therapist, I think you have to live an affirmative life to some degree. Be familiar with the issues. If you're on Facebook, follow groups that are going to be sending input your way, that even whether it's a local thing or if it's just a conversation that's being had. Because like Carla said, that there sometimes, because of the populations we work with, initially when you're a little new to it, you can really sort of focus on unhelpful things, right? Like focusing too much on the transition, focusing too much on being queer or being a person of color. I mean, it's important. These people experience escalated rates of mental health, whether it be addiction, suicidality, etc. But the research shows that you can also be a little too clumsy and focus on those things, as opposed to what we know. Like, how is this person? What are the resources this person have? What are the strengths? How are they resilient? Because they often are. And those are the things to highlight and pay attention to, for sure.
Powerful words, you guys. Thank you so much. This has been a really smooth, first podcast.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah. It was.
Good.
It was.
I'm going to stop the recording here, and you guys just hang on if you don't care. But thank you to everybody who joined us today, and we're excited for the next